All right, so we've increased government spending, let's say, and we've said this could introduce a nice multiplier effect that implies that fiscal policy could potentially be very effective. But there's potentially some other impacts that might cause the multiplier to be smaller than what we've hypothesized. So, what are some of these things? Well, for starters, I think the thing we need to ask here is where does the government get the funding for the increase in G or the decrease in taxes? Right? So take the current rebates that the government handed out. So they spent effectively an additional $2.2 trillion on various measures, and that's going to increase, right? So where does the government get the $2.2 trillion? That's the question. And so so a lot of times what we will say, or what is true, is this increase in spending or decrease in taxes is almost always what we say deficit financed. And so what we mean by that is that the government simply runs a budget deficit. They spend more than they take in taxes in order to cover this. And so you might ask, okay, well, still, right, if I'm going to spend an additional $2.2 trillion that I don't have tax revenue to cover, where does it come from? And the answer is that the government has to borrow. So the government is going to effectively take out loans. They issue what we call treasury securities. And the government issues these bonds, and they say, all right, well, give me $1,000, the government, and I will give you a loan and repay it with some specified interest rate over a specified period of time. And so the government, in order to finance these expansionary fiscal policies, has to borrow money. So the government debt has to increase. And so what we want to think about is, well, does that have any implications beyond what we've seen, right? So we've seen that what the spending does, but now we have to think about what does the borrowing do? And we have to go back to our credit market, where we had the quantity of credit, you can think of it in that way, and we had the real interest rate on the vertical axis. And so we had supply of credit and we had demand of credit. And so where does supply come from? Well, it comes from people that are saving, is partly the supply of credit. And you have demand for credit, which is coming from various sources in the economy. So that would be consumers looking for loans. You want a car loan? You are demand for credit. If a company wants to invest in new machines and buildings, etc., that is also going to be demand for credit. Now, there's a couple ways you could work. You could change supply or demand here of credit, but we're going to change demand because I think that's kind of a more straightforward way to think of it. So when government debt increases, that's increasing the demand for credit, right? So the government says, okay, we want to borrow. And so however much they want to borrow, it's going to be true at every interest rate. And that's going to shift the demand for credit to the right. And notice in the credit market, that's going to increase the interest rate. Now, one thing I want you to note is that notice, right? So if I kind of go across here, I'm going to call this Q3. From Q1 to Q3 is the total amount of government debt that the government has bought up. And what I want you to notice is that the total increase in the quantity of credit is less than that. So does that mean the government isn't able to borrow what they want? No. What it means is that because the interest rate went up, the government borrowing is crowding out some of the private borrowing that would have taken place. So the government debt increases, demand for credit goes up. And what that means is that the real interest rate goes up. And we move along the demand curve. And that means that private credit is going to go down. And specifically, right, what a lot of that is, right? So the interest rate goes up and consumers buy fewer cars, fewer houses, and firms engage in less investment. So what's going on is private consumption and private investment are both decreasing as a result of the government borrowing. It just makes sense intuitively, right? The government wants to borrow $2.2 trillion. If they do that, that takes away $2.2 trillion worth of credit that would have been allocated towards consumption or investment, right? And so the real interest rate is going to go up in response, decreasing that consumption and investment. And so depending on how large those effects are, that's going to reduce the size of the multiplier, right? So if we kind of come over here and think about what's going on, here's my diagram. And so the idea was G went up, Y went up, and that caused consumption to go up, Y to go up, consumption to go up, etc. But now what we're saying is that depending on how much credit the government is using and how that affects the interest rate, we're going to have a decrease in investment and a decrease in consumption. And so the total impact on Y here depends on which effect is larger. Does the crowding out effect tend to dominate, or does this other multiplier effect tend to dominate? And so what this means is that the multiplier could, in theory, be less than 1. Meaning if I increase government spending by $100, Y would go up by, say, $75, less than the initial increase, right? So the government spends an additional $100, but we only get $75 of extra real GDP or extra income. Why? Well, because the government borrowed the $100 and that crowded out or reduced private investment and consumption by, let's say, $25, right? And so the end result is that real GDP went up by less than the $100. So depending on how large the effect of the government borrowing is on the interest rate, that could make the crowding out effect larger or smaller and affect the value of the multiplier. So that's a brief introduction to crowding out. The story is obviously much deeper than that, which we can't get into in an introductory class. But it certainly is a very interesting topic, right? How does government spending interact with other parts of the economy? And we kind of get a flavor of that in economics. This is a very rich and interesting topic. So hopefully you've kind of enjoyed this introduction. So, I guess I've got already reduced the size of the multiplier here. How big is the multiplier in practice, by the way? Well, the estimates tend to range somewhere in here. So we don't know exactly. It's really hard to determine what the value of the multiplier is because we don't get to run clean experiments in the way that you would in, say, physics, for example, right? So I can't hold everything else constant. So when the government changes its spending, there's lots of other things happening in the economy. And we have to try to isolate what is the exact impact of government spending. And that's hard to do. And so you've got estimates that range anywhere from 0.6 to 1.2. So that the crowding out effect could be very large or it could be relatively small. And so there's a question on Canvas that I want you to try to answer that kind of has you walk through and think through this with some particular numbers.